In the early morning hours on Monday, February 26th, Calgary-based Lynx Air sadly ceased operations. The news came just a few days prior on February 22nd, when the airline revealed that they had filed for creditor protection, with operations slowly winding down over the weekend. According to Lynx, they'd been experiencing, quote, compounding financial pressures associated with inflation, fuel costs, regulatory costs, and competition in the Canadian market, and after being unable to secure additional funding, this unfortunate decision was made. Although a brief but memorable addition to the Canadian airline sector, Lynx Air is one I had a personal connection to, having been there for the delivery of their first plane, as well as on board their inaugural flight. I also had the pleasure of working with them privately on a few occasions. Sunday, February 25th was their last full day operating, but you could still book last-minute tickets on some of their flights until then. With all of that in mind, plus a bit of persuasion, I ended up booking a seat on what would be their final scheduled passenger flight from Vancouver to Calgary. I do want to make one thing clear though, this wasn't just for the sake of making a YouTube video, but for documenting history, and for the hundreds of talented people at Lynx Air who worked so hard to make the airline what it was, giving them the send-off they deserve. Over the course of the weekend, Lynx's last couple of flights were scheduled in such a way that they could get all of their airplanes and crews back to Calgary. As a result, their final scheduled departure was Flight 107, leaving Vancouver at around 8:30 p.m. on Sunday evening. Though it wouldn't be the last Lynx Air flight to land, it would be the last revenue flight to take off. Lynx Air's check-in desks in YVR were in the international check-in hall, a bit of a walk from the domestic gates. I had gotten myself here to Vancouver a few hours before, and so lined up right when check-in opened to get myself a printed copy of my boarding pass for posterity. It is sad to think that this is the last time these screens will show this, though. For their domestic flights, Lynx typically use the B gates here at YVR, the newer part of which is pretty nice. We'd be leaving from gate B20 in the older part though, which doesn't have a lot of seating when all 4 gates here have a flight at the same time. About 2 hours before departure, our plane was towed into the gate, this 3.5-year-old 737 MAX 8, registered as Charlie Foxtrot Uniform Lima Juliet. Originally, this plane was pretty obviously destined for Norwegian Air Sweden, but wasn't taken up by them. It was stored for a few years and became the 4th plane delivered to Lynx Air in July 2022. At that point, Lynx was in their first summer of operations, but their next 3 planes had been delayed and they had to lease some from other carriers. As a result, this one was delivered to them without time to be repainted. Tails 805, 806, and 807 were actually all built for Norwegian, but Tail 807 here was the only one delivered like this, and stayed in basic Norwegian livery for its entire year and a half with Lynx Air. It had been here in Vancouver since the day of the announcement on the 22nd, and this, effectively one-way flight, would be how they got this tail back to Calgary. Now, here's where things got interesting. As boarding time approached, I noticed that there only seemed to be 5 crew members around the gate, when there are usually 6, 4 cabin crew and 2 pilots. That was soon followed up by this whopping 3-hour and 15-minute delay as everyone tried to figure out what was happening. To their credit, the contracted customer service agents here in YVR did their best to explain the situation amidst several worried passengers. Part of that concern was that Lynx said their operations would cease at 12:01 a.m. Mountain Time on February 26th. This new departure time was definitely well after this seemingly hard deadline. The problem here was that this was a nearly full flight, and apparently one of the 4 cabin crew members was a no-show. They can legally fly with 3, but it would mean bumping 60 or so people onto a, well, not-existent next flight. There was one more flight inbound to Vancouver from Toronto though, and Lynx's solution was to use 1 cabin crew from that flight to operate this one at full capacity. That second plane was supposed to be ferrying empty back to Calgary anyway. You try explaining all of that to a group of tired and non-aviation savvy people though. I genuinely felt bad for the CSAs, especially when the louder people just could not wrap their head around this. I think it was that very specific time that is still all over their websites that had people alarmed, but we were assured the flight was definitely still happening.
The flight's delayed to 23:45. We had a flight attendant who was a no-show. We do have a plane coming in about a couple hours, gate B21. We're going to utilize one of the flight attendants to operate on the flight 107 to Calgary. Again, thank you for your patience, and again, flight's delayed to 23:45. Thank you.
With that though, I had a few more hours to get even more acquainted with YVR's B gates. As much as I would have loved to take a nap, that was a dangerous game to play on a flight as significant as this, so I grabbed some coffee and walked around for a bit longer. You know it's bad when you start riding the moving walkways for fun, though. In the meantime, I noticed that all of the Lynx Air signage here was already taken down, and even the baggage sizers were getting ready to be loaded onto the second plane. Not gonna lie, the reality of all of this really hit me then. However, if anyone knows how I can buy one of those... A couple hours went by, and that flight coming in from Toronto eventually arrived, operated by one of the newest planes in the fleet, Charlie Golf Juliet Hotel Kilo, delivered in July 2023. This plane also has a slight livery modification that they introduced last summer on their 7th plane onwards, with these paw prints along the side and on the belly. For whatever reason though, these are only on the right side of the plane, which I've never understood why. This also marked the final arrival of a Lynx Air aircraft into Vancouver, which just so happened to be at the same gate that the inaugural flight arrived at just under 2 years ago. Back at our gate, our 4th crew member quickly made their way over, and boarding began, much to everyone's delight.
To Calgary, we will begin boarding in a few moments.
You guys are going home. You guys are going home. Hell yeah.
As a special treat, the mood lighting was fittingly set to Lynx Red as everyone boarded, and my seat back to Calgary was 6F. I've always liked the fact that these slimline seats make for plenty of legroom even in an all-economy cabin, and as I was hoping for, 6F also has an excellent engine view. We also had a good view of that other MAX parked 2 gates down. Now, you may have noticed that these seats look a bit different than on Lynx Air's first 3 planes. I believe that's because these are just Norwegian seats, but they were still perfectly fine for Lynx Air's purposes. There are obviously no headrests, but again, you can't ask for much on a short 1-hour flight, and I was decently comfortable. Soon enough, boarding was complete, and we were welcomed on board with a message from our captain and cabin crew.
Ladies and gentlemen, flight deck captain speaking. My name is Les. I have the pleasure today of working with Aaron, and in the back we have 4 of some of Lynx's finest. We have Ranch, Dominic, Estefania, and Brooke. I'd like to welcome aboard Lynx Flight 107 service to Calgary, and the last flight Vancouver to Calgary for this. I'd like to thank you for your patronage over the last 2 years, and your patience as well for this evening. We were short a crew member, so we ended up stealing one from another flight that was inbound.
A pleasant good evening to everyone. Welcome aboard Lynx Air, flight number Y9107, now departing for our home base in Calgary. We do appreciate everyone's patience during the delay. As you are aware, this is the very last flight of Lynx Air from Vancouver to Calgary. We have 4 flight attendants on board. In row 23 we have Brooke, row 12 we have Estefania, row 1 I have Ranch, and I'm your in-charge Dom. As your safety is important to us, we ask that you pull attention as we outline the safety features of this aircraft.
With that, we were pushed back, the engines were started, and here's the final revenue departure of a Lynx Air flight off of YVR's runway 26 left.
turbulence is expected throughout most of our flight, we unfortunately will not be commencing any water service. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed this last Lynx Air flight to Calgary.
Airborne out of Vancouver on this beautiful clear night, the lights stayed off for the first little bit. Each seat here has the essentials, including an adjustable tray table and the safety card for the 737 MAX in that literature pocket. There is also a smaller storage pocket below that, with room for a few items. As we made our way eastbound, the moonlight was super strong, lighting up the clouds below and making for quite a cool effect. The seatbelt sign did eventually go off, and I took that opportunity to get up for a second. As is typical of most ULCCs, Lynx Air had 189 seats on their 737s in the standard all-economy layout. These Norwegian ones didn't have much else done to them as far as the cabin goes, but one thing I like are the red curtains they have at the front and the back. This plane did also have some traces of its original customer in the galleys. The lavatories in the back were the same slimline ones on most 737 MAXs and are nice and bright. It ended up being less bumpy than originally thought, so the cabin lights went up briefly as the crew performed one last water service. That was always a unique part about Lynx, the fact that they had no buy on board at all. Whether that was a good decision or not, well, now's not really the time. With only 59 minutes in the air tonight, this flight unfortunately went by pretty quickly, and we were soon approaching our top of descent.
Again, it's been a pleasure having you on board this morning. We sincerely appreciate your business, as we know you have a choice. I'd like to say we'd hope to see you again in the future, but that's not in the cards. But anyway, enjoy your stay in Calgary. Thanks.
So, a few minutes from now, and that's it. It's hard to describe this feeling of flying with an airline for the last time, but I can't say it's a feeling I like very much. Even so, the professionalism of everyone involved today, even on a solemn occasion like this, speaks volumes. For the record, though we were the last passenger flight to take off, there was another delayed one that landed in Calgary from Toronto just a few minutes after we did. Still, I am going to miss Lynx Air and the bit of color that they brought to Canadian airports. I will also miss hearing their call sign. I still think Dauntless is one of the best call signs in the country. As we all know, Canadian aviation is tough, but it's also pretty small, which is why I think saying goodbye to any airline that even dared to attempt to change things is tough too. Lynx Air's time may have been brief, but I'd say they left their mark on the industry.
Lynx Air welcomes you to Calgary. The current local time is 2:06 in the morning on Monday, the 26th of February. Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened and carry-on baggage stowed. And to everyone on board, we do sincerely thank you from the bottom of our hearts for choosing to fly with Lynx Air this evening. Unfortunately, this is the last day of our operations. We have been connecting Canadians for the last 2 years with affordable low fares. My name is Dom, along with Ranj, Brooke, Estefanias. This is your Calgary-based crew at Lynx Air. Now signing off. Thank you and goodbye.
So long, Dauntless, and thanks for watching.